client. Chairman Henry, that case could have present-day application. As Confucius might say, person who uses bit too rough and pulls too hard on reins may make horse jump in wrong direction. It's now my pleasure to present the Chairman of the FCC, the Honorable E. William Henry.
President Diggs, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose only time will tell whether after today's address you'll be ready to give me a verdict or whether you'll want to sue. I hope it's the former. I noticed a cartoon in the New Yorker recently, which some of you may have seen. A corporation president addressing his annual meeting of stockholders was saying, in spite of continued government harassment, confiscatory income taxes, subsidized foreign competition, spiraling inflation, arbitrary and unyielding demands from labor, I'm happy to report that for the 10th year in succession, profits are at an all-time high. I was reminded of this cartoon one morning last week when there came across my desk an FCC document reporting television financial data for 1962. It contained very good news, which I imagine most of you have seen, but which I'm happy to report now to those of you who may have missed it, as well as for those of you who have shared in it, and for those of you who are still awaiting your cut. The television industry, including 3 networks, reported $1.5 billion in broadcast revenues, which is a gain of $168 million, or 12.7% above 1961 revenues. Industry profits before federal income tax were above $300 million for the first time, up almost 1/3 from 1961. Over a 10-year period, revenues have increased about 4.5 times, and profits about 5.5 times. Now, I'm sure that this rosy financial picture was created in substantial measure by the broad, vigorous strokes of the industry leaders and representatives now assembled in this room. Nothing succeeds like success, and I, for one, admire your business acumen and your obvious dedication to your chosen field. I know I speak for all the commissioners as well as myself when I say that we are indeed honored by the presence of such a large gathering of distinguished industry leaders here today. And the talent here assembled is extraordinary. In fact, I would say there's enough talent in this room to fill an entire day's program without a single commercial. In fact, the only missing dignitary is New York's latest emigrant to the West Coast, Pat Weaver, and he cabled me from Chavez Ravine. This speech is popularly billed in the trade press as my maiden address to a Broadcasters Association since becoming chairman. Like many debutantes, I deliberated for quite a time before deciding on an appropriate subject for my coming out. Many have counseled me to present a friendly image, to give you a boost instead of a bludgeon, and I am tempted to take their advice. For I have nothing but the friendliest feelings and highest respect for the many fine broadcasters, advertisers, association representatives, and professional people that I've come to know during my tenure at the Commission. And I would hope that these feelings would be mutual and would grow, not diminish, in the years ahead. But your time is valuable, and I think what you most want to hear are some of my impressions of some of the major problems with which the Commission is now wrestling. There are many that deserve our attention, and I wish we had time more than we do to discuss them. For example, I would enjoy discussing the special role of networks, the valuable contributions to broadcasting that only networks are able to make, and their resulting unique responsibilities. And I would like to explore with you the question of whether advertisers seeking sponsorship of programs which are well accepted, but which appeal to less than maximum audience, are in fact knocking on network doors and finding no one at home. I think also that a discussion of sustaining time might be profitable. If many affiliates often fail to clear network sustaining public affairs programs, or those only partially sponsored, and the public is thereby deprived of much of the best that the networks have to offer, then the Commission indeed has cause for concern. Or take the question of broadcast time for political candidates. Political issues are becoming more important and more complex. Radio and television are coming more and more to be relied upon by political candidates to tell their story to the public. The public, in turn, is relying increasingly upon radio and television to provide it with insight into making one of its most important decisions, how to cast a vote. The cost to the candidates is skyrocketing, with 30 to 40% of campaign funds typically going to the broadcaster. I would therefore have liked to discuss further with you a thought that I had recently, that for each segment of time sold by a broadcaster in a particular race, a proportionate or equal segment of time would have to be donated for the use of all candidates in that race. The subject of summer reruns would likewise make a timely topic. Does the voracious, insatiable maw of television require so many reruns between June and September? Or are there independent producers and writers with a wealth of new program ideas which the networks disdain? For the moment, however, we'll leave those ogres locked in the cellar, observing only that upon subjecting them to the daylight of reason, I think we might find that they were in reality kindly old gentlemen, eager to serve the broadcaster and the public alike. And the hottest subject at the moment, at least if New York is a good industry barometer, is pay television. Perhaps on another occasion we can discuss this at length. I would, however, preface my main theme with just one digression. You will recall that 14 years ago, in 1949, the Commission issued a policy statement which said, in essence, if a broadcaster treats one aspect of a controversial issue of public importance, he must afford reasonable opportunities for the presentation of contrasting viewpoints. A 12-page document, remarkably short for a bureaucracy, was mailed to each broadcast licensee and widely distributed to communications lawyers and industry representatives. This, as you know, constitutes our fairness doctrine. And to my knowledge, no responsible person in the industry takes issue with its basic principle. It has been discussed many times with committees on Capitol Hill. Congress itself codified the principle in Section 315 of the Communications Act. And yet, when the Commission recently made efforts to apply the policy, it was met with anguished cries of foul, straight-faced pleas of ignorance, and incredulous inquiries as to whether we really meant what we said. I would be the first to agree that one of the bureaucrat's besetting sins is an inability to say what he means. In fact, we all recognize the concern of the industry with our recent interpretations of the doctrine, and we are at the moment working toward the publication of a primer which will set forth more specific guidelines. And I think this will be of great service not only to the Commission, but to the industry. But we are not the Federal Conversation Commission, and I am startled, to say the least, by the amount of sound and fury that can arise when people find out that we mean what we say. Surely, one of the essential purposes of administrative agencies is to take high-flown principles to which everyone is willing to pay lip service and to give them flesh, bone, and sinew for existence in the everyday world. Surely an agency's practice must at some point live up to its preaching. This, at any rate, is one quality I would hope the FCC has or will become known for, that when we urge practical fairness, we mean it. That when we speak of a broadcaster's good faith determination of his community's needs and interests as the price of a license, we mean it. When we say that we will examine his performance at renewal time to find out whether he has made a good faith effort, we mean it. And to turn finally to the subject that I decided to discuss today, when we say that we are concerned about the degree of over-commercialization in broadcasting, we mean that too. Now let me say at the outset that I recognize that there are genuine and serious problems involved in the question of whether the FCC should attempt to establish advertising time standards, and if it chooses to enter this field, what standards to adopt. I recognize the sincerity and the good work of the National Association of Broadcasters and of the state associations, and that many fine licensees have no problems of over-commercialization. I recognize the real efforts in the field of self-regulation that have been made by the subscribers to the NAB codes and of the progress there being made. I also assure you that I am alert to the pressures accumulating within the industry which have raised the interest to a fevered pitch. Doctors recognize, however, that sometimes a fever must run its course, and that often a patient must get worse before he gets better. And if the industry's temperature rises after my remarks today, I'm confident that it will shortly thereafter be stronger than ever. For no member of the Commission would consider the adoption of a rule that we were not convinced the industry could live with and live well. We know that commercials are the lifeblood of your industry, and we do not intend to prescribe leeches. Now, I decided to talk about commercialism today for two reasons. To begin with, I want to bring the seriousness of the problem into better focus, and secondly, I want to convey the fact that the Commission will consider it carefully and with your interests fully in mind. On the subject of commercialism or over-commercialization, we start from this fundamental principle with which all would agree. Broadcasting frequencies are allocated to licensees to provide a local medium of expression and entertainment for the listening and viewing public. Of course, use of the medium for advertisers serves a useful public purpose. And of course, advertising provides the financial support for programs of all kinds, including the public affairs and other public service programs that may not always pay their own way in a commercial system. But after you have said all this, the programs, from the point of view of the government as well as the public, are the payoff. In a free enterprise commercial broadcasting system, advertising is part of the price we pay to get the programs. But when it begins to interfere unduly with the programs, to limit unreasonably the time devoted to them, to restrict the content put into them, or to frustrate by interruption the enjoyment and understanding the public gets out of them, then we indeed have a real problem. For the past several years, since the FCC began to keep statistics on the subjects about broadcasting, the subject of commercials, their number, length, frequency, loudness, timing, and so forth, has been high on our complaint list. In fact, it is second only to complaints about programs generally. In fiscal 1962, we received approximately 2,500 complaints about advertising, of which about 35%, the biggest category, related to length, amount, and frequency. Moreover, every detailed study of public attitudes toward broadcasting, whether radio or television, has found various aspects of commercials far up on the list of things that people find wrong with the medium. In Professor Steiner's well-known study of public attitudes toward television, some 63% of the people interviewed agreed that most commercials are too long. And even more ominously, when the sample was asked, what, if anything, do you like most about commercials, well over 25% replied, nothing. And the complaint is not limited to eggheads. People of all levels of education, income, and tastes seem to agree on this subject. Now, this may not amount to a crisis, but it does amount to a continuing problem that requires continuing concern. I have been told many times that this is something about which the government does not need to be concerned. After all, so the reasoning goes, advertisers and broadcasters want to keep the public's attention and goodwill. They want to please the public, not annoy it. And the broadcaster who over-commercializes runs the risk of losing his audience to a competitor who doesn't. So the free market and the public's ability to turn the dial, according to this view, will keep commercialization within tolerable limits. Now, this is obviously a point of view with considerable appeal. It suggests that our fundamental goal will be achieved in the automatic workings of the marketplace. And I am well aware that our free enterprise system can accomplish many, many public goals far better than the alternatives which have been suggested from time to time. But the question here is whether the system will supply an automatic answer. And on that question, it seems to me, there is certainly room for argument. Suppose that you were in our shoes, as Mr. Diggs suggested, and that you were responding to a letter from a member of the public complaining that many of his or her favorite programs were being ruined by frequent, long, interrupting commercials. Could you, in all honesty, reply, "You have no cause for worry. All you have to do is switch to another station with fewer commercials, and the broadcaster will soon get the message"? I don't think so, because the answer is just not that simple. Where is that other station? Who wins the argument between the man who wants to put in another commercial and the one who wants to keep it out? The public, after all, will take a lot of punishment in order to watch or listen to a program it likes. And it's not easy to demonstrate a loss of audience or effectiveness as a result of adding just one more. Last spring, for instance, Mr. John W. Burgard and Mr. Max Banzhaf told the Association of National Advertisers that the clutter appearing on most American television sets almost every half an hour, and over-commercialization generally, are seriously hampering the effectiveness of television advertising. But the television industry has failed to jump on this bandwagon. It is still, in very large measure, addicted to massive doses of clutter at the station break. In addition, we know that, other things being equal, the radio or television station that sells more commercials can afford to sell them at a lower price. The broadcaster who wants to maintain high standards may find it difficult to do so when faced with a loss of business to a lower-priced rival. So the argument that a man who over-commercializes is bound to lose audiences may not be persuasive. If the viewer or listener has to depend upon dial switching, he may have to wait a long time before he gets relief. And in the meantime, he may well have concluded that the only difference between radio and television is that one gives him plugs in his ears and the other spots before his eyes. Large numbers of people in the industry, recognizing these problems, have developed voluntary codes of commercial practice. These codes, they argue, are the best way to define and to maintain minimum standards of industry performance. And who would attempt to deny that self-regulation is the best regulation, if it's effective regulation? The NAB code boards have made commendable efforts and considerable strides. The NAB seal of good practice is indeed highly prized. But the strength of one's conscience, it seems to me, in this area, is too often directly related to one's profit picture. And the seal of good practice, I'm afraid, will always have to compete with the seal of the United States Treasurer. Moreover, one aspect of commercials to which the public strongly objects is virtually untouched by the NAB codes, and this is the matter of interruptions. The teaser opening, such as, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, the President has just asked the Congress to declare war." We'll be back with that story after a word from our sponsor. Or as the announcer in the more sophisticated cartoon, which contained a picture of an atomic explosion in the background, the announcer was speaking and said, "And so, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like the end of civilization as we know it. And now here's David Crank for the Ajax Oil Company." Or take the subtle bait, hook, switch, and stuff of the Late Show. The viewer is baited with solid programming the first 15 minutes, switched to double and triple spotting once he's hooked, and stuffed with commercials every 5 minutes thereafter. And it must sometimes seem to the public that the film editing for which Hollywood pays such fancy salaries is redone for television by the gardener with a pair of rusty shears. Now, in this connection, I noticed that Mr. David Ogilvy, chairman of Ogilvy, Benson and Mather, and sometimes described as one of advertising's free thinkers, recently had some remarks on this subject. I'm sure many of you in this room also noticed it. But he's quoted in last Wednesday's Herald Tribune as being a firm believer in the power of television advertising, but that he was angered to the point of violence by the interruption of bad commercials in the middle of a program. Unless the government comes up with some strong regulations soon, he said, he was afraid the public would agree with historian Arnold Toynbee that the destination of Western civilization turns on the issue of our struggle with all that Madison Avenue stands for. There is, in addition, a more subtle aspect to the problem of interruptions. In a commercial broadcasting system, programs are created largely by people who know that they must fit in to a commercial format. So they write to create the natural break. If those who create try hard enough, they can make natural breaks come almost as often as the toughest sales manager would want. A few programs, of course, come with natural built-in breaks. Consider, if you will, the tremendous foresight of Abner Doubleday, who years before radio and television invented a game with at least 17 natural breaks, not counting those when the pitcher takes a shower. Some radio stations have solved this entire problem by limiting their programming entirely to records and short segments of talk that are no longer than records. On such a station, as I'm sure many of you know, it may be impossible to tell the programming from the interruptions without a scorecard. For example, one station submitted some program logs to us recently, which bear at appropriate places the following unforgettable note to disc jockeys: play a record between each commercial. Indeed, the cultural historian of the future may well point to the broadcasting industry as the creator of a new art form, the program which, no matter what its length or content, music, comedy, drama, adventure, is split into 5-minute acts. And the same historian may have some things to say about the effect this art form has and has had upon the viewing and listening public, as well as the writers. Now, I do not say that all of these problems can and must or even should be covered by rule, or that the NAB's code is a failure because it does not solve them. However, anyone who has placed his hand on the Bible, looked solemnly at the judge, and sworn to represent the interests of the viewing and listening public must sooner or later question whether industry codes are, in and of themselves, a sufficient answer to the problem of over-commercialization. And while I respect those who fear that government intervention would remove the industry's incentive to keep its own house clean, I think it clear that appropriate government action should not and will not undercut self-regulation generally. The content of commercials, the question of taste and intelligence, is in many ways the biggest problem of all. But except for such matters as fraud and deception, problems of content should be handled by forces within the industry. In addition, it is well to remember that the NAB television code contains some 14 titles, only one of which deals with advertising time standards. There are a variety of subjects in the code, from astrology to subliminal perception, which need attention, which are mentioned by the codes, but which do not lend themselves to treatment by government. So the codes will always have a real function to perform and will always exert a salutary influence. The electronic huckster might have cause for concern, but the bell will not toll for the codes. Now, against this background, let me attempt to put the Commission's recent proposal in some sort of perspective. In our notice, we expressed our concern with the problem of over-commercialization. We stated that we had had a policy against over-commercialization for as long as we could remember, that policy had never been reduced to writing or made specific, that for the benefit of ourselves and broadcasters alike, it should be made more specific, and that we had no fixed ideas as to the final shape any rule should take. We suggested as a starter the present standards of the NAB Code, pointing out that they may not fit all situations or cover all problems. We earnestly solicited the views of the advertisers, the industry, and the public. We took great pains to point out that the comments should be specific, that if the public interest was to suffer as a result of such a rule, we should be told, chapter and verse, exactly why and how this would take place. If a particular rule would put a particular station out of business, if it would hurt the small businessman or advertiser, then we should be told about it. The necessary implication was that we did not want merely to be inundated by dog-eared denunciations and oversimplified, unsubstantiated conclusions. And I trust that the industry will recognize the seriousness of the matter, and I hope that it will respond as so earnestly requested. And I repeat, We are aware that the same rule may not serve for a 50-kilowatt clear channel radio station, which operates 24 hours a day in a large city, and a 250-watt station, which operates from sunrise to sundown in a small town. We want facts about radio stations in seaside resorts whose peak business may be seasonal, about radio stations in small towns where local department stores and other businesses may concentrate their advertising on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, and about stations in sparsely settled areas of the West or other places in this country which must depend largely upon local advertisers. The Commission is seeking the widest range of information on specific problem areas. But the burden of the correspondence we've been getting from broadcasters recently, and the burden of the comments which have been filed in our proceeding to date, is that the task is impossible. But we are not told why it is impossible. Now, the choice of tactics is, of course, yours, but surely a little less smoke and a little more fire would help to clear the air. For after all, when it comes to a question of values and their priority, the Communications Act leaves no room for doubt. However important advertising may be to the industry, it is not sacrosanct. Many requirements of the Commission have a direct relationship to gross revenue. The requirement of a first-class operator, the usually recognized need to carry religious, educational, and public affairs programs of a less profitable nature, and the limitation on the total number of stations that can be owned, to mention but a few. Can it then be beyond the pale to ask whether, in the case of radio, for example, a rule which allows a maximum of 18 and an average of 14 minutes of commercial time in any 1 hour would prevent stations from giving reasonable service to advertisers? Must radio stations really devote to commercials more than 30% of their peak listening hours in order to live healthily, if not handsomely? And more important, does it necessarily follow that an FCC rule in this area would automatically reduce profits? Isn't it just as probable that fewer commercials would become more attractive and command a higher price? In the final analysis, the field of over-commercialization is simply another instance where the public interest at some point clashes with private interests, a relevant but not a controlling factor. I would therefore ask, indeed I would appeal, to every knowledgeable person within the industry for hard, concrete information which will allow the Commission to reach a fair judgment. And I would add that if the Commission is to be true to its trust, nothing less than specific, concrete information will do. We certainly cannot assume that good advertising, good business, and good broadcasting cannot go hand in hand. And I reiterate, we have no preconceptions. Some aspects of the problem may yield to a flat rule, and others may not. Some, such as the question of interruptions, may need more study by both government and industry before a reasonable policy can evolve. And a formal rulemaking proceeding in which we communicate with the public and the industry by means of written comments may in this instance be an inadequate vehicle. I would personally think that after comments have been filed, a face-to-face meeting between the Commission en banc and representatives of broadcasting stations, networks, program producers, and advertisers would be extremely helpful. I am, in brief, wide open for the reception of any helpful information. And at the present stage, I have only one basic thought. For 36 years, the Commission has relied upon vague policy pronouncements condemning undefined over-commercialization. It is time and past time to get specific, to bring this policy down out of the clouds and into the homes of viewers and listeners. So whether by rule or by policy statement, we need to establish criteria which will tell the public and the industry what we mean by over-commercialization. We need to do so in terms sufficiently specific to be effective in protecting the public and fair in dealing with free competitive enterprise. For the question of commercial time standards will not go away. Neither the Commission nor the industry can ignore that fact. Some might like to forget the problem. There are times when all of us wish we could. But the public will remember, and it is entitled to a solution. Thank you very much.
Chairman Henry, thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I'm sure that you know from the applause you've just heard how much it was appreciated. Thanks to our honored guests for being here today, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Meeting adjourned.